Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the keynote lecture for our special Human Rights Conference today. My name is Kyotero Tsutsui, in case you just joined us, and I'm the director of the Donia Human Rights Center. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Beth Simmons as our keynote speaker. Professor Simmons is Andrea Mitchell University Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Since earning her PhD at Harvard, she has taught at Duke, UC Berkeley, and Harvard before moving to UPenn in 2016. She has also spent a year working at the International Monetary Fund. She has directed the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University from 2006 to 2013. She is a past president of the International Studies Association, and she has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her research is situated at the intersection of international law, international political economy, and global human rights. And she's undoubtedly one of the leading scholars in international relations. Her first book, Who Adjusts? Domestic Sources of Foreign Economic Policy During the Interwar Years, published in 1994, is a cross-national analysis that examined factors that explain different timings for defection from moving away from the gold standard in the interwar period of the 1920s and 1930s. Which focused attention on domestic politics as a determinant of national responses to the international economy. The book won, in 1995, the American Political Science Association's Woodrow Wilson Award for the best book published in the United States on government, politics, or international affairs. It won a couple other awards, too. Her second book, Mobilizing for Human Rights, International Law in International Law in Domestic Politics, published in 2009, offered virtually a definitive statement about the efficacy of international human rights treaties, which with meticulous and comprehensive analysis, quantitative analysis of the effects of key international human rights treaties on relevant domestic practices. This book also won the same award, the American Political Science Association's Woodrow Wilson Award for the best book, and several other awards, such as the International Studies Association's annual Best Book Award and the Stein-Rockham Prize, and so on. She has published, other than those two solo-authored books, she has published at least 7 edited volumes and countless scholarly articles, and she continues to publish high-quality studies in top social science journals such as American Political Science Review and International Organization. When we started, John Wu and I, when we started thinking about a keynote lecture for this conference, she was really the first and last candidate for us. We couldn't really think of any other scholar better suited for this keynote lecture. We were looking for somebody who could speak to methodological innovations in social sciences as they apply to human rights research, and also somebody who also has deep understanding of substantive issues involved. So we are really delighted that she is here, and she has been absorbing all the presentations and discussions since the morning, and now she's ready to share her insights about the future of human rights and the future of human rights research. So please join me in welcoming Professor Beth Simmons.
Thank you. You might have thought I was working away on my email or something else, but what I was actually doing all day long was editing these slides based on what I was hearing today. So I've taken your work on board, and that is because I've been just amazed at the sort of rich buffet of evidence and approaches available and the progress that's being made, especially by younger scholars, in the area of understanding international and domestic human rights. And so I just really wanted to say that from the beginning, that it is utterly impressive to look at young scholars harnessing new methods and making new findings and seeing things that we simply couldn't see when I was sort of working in the area of doing quantitative research. in the area of international human rights. So I appreciate very much what you've shown us today. And I think the future of research in international human rights is going to be a bright one based on what I've heard today. I would like to say, though, that as Professor Tsutsui said today when he opened the conference, that we appear to be at some kind of a juncture, a critical juncture in the area of international human rights, because much of what we know as the international human rights regime seems to be under some kind of siege, certainly heavy criticism and maybe as strong as siege. And Professor So added this morning that while things are changing and information technologies are changing in crucial ways, and it's our job to figure out how this could impact human rights, he also asked us to think very hard about how the results of social science research can inform policy and practice. And so I just want to see if I can touch a little bit on thinking along those lines in this talk today, because honestly, I could not agree more. And it could be a function of age. It could be that because I'm not stressed out by getting into the AJPS or the APSR or the JOP, because my job is fairly secure, at least for the time being, then maybe I feel like I can sort of take the luxury of speculating a little bit and trying to tie evidence and talk to the policy world. But I would urge you to be thinking in that way as well. I would urge you to be thinking and realizing that the people in this room have a very special place in trying to inform policy. Human rights debates, in my opinion, are terribly uninformed and misinformed. And so somebody asked this very interesting question and didn't get the answer in that last panel. Who's got responsibilities? Who's got responsibilities for human rights? And I think we in the room actually do have some responsibilities along these lines. And so I would really like to urge all of you to think as you go forward in your careers, not just about hitting the top journals, which you must do, but ultimately trying to speak also to audiences in ways that they can understand, that they will appreciate. We need to learn how to make points of contact with the world of practice and contribute to the stream of general discourse. And I think that is our responsibility, frankly. So I hope that as your careers progress, that you'll feel increasingly comfortable doing that, that you will be able to sort of take your work that is so very rigorous and think about how it connects with the most significant and important issues that we are facing today. One thing I just thought I would do is just say a few random thoughts at first on how social science, research on human rights, what we need to keep in mind. So I start maybe just with a little sort of sense of social science research and human rights. The first thing that I want to say is that this room has been exemplary in this regard, but so much of what passes for research on human rights is headline chasing. That is, human rights researchers will often just start with everything wrong in the world and tell you that the world is on irretrievable decline and human rights are at the end of times, basically. You don't know how many, well, you probably do, although these are not people maybe you talk to quite so much, but I talk to these people quite a lot. And it always starts with some kind of negative assessment, and they come to the negative assessment of the world by reciting to me, to everyone, the headlines. This group knows you can't do that. This group knows that the headlines have biases. They have biases having to do with ways to sell the news. They play to what we want to hear, and we don't want to hear necessarily that things are always good. We want to hear that things are in a tragic situation and getting worse. And that is compounded, bless their hearts, by human rights activists, honestly, who need to keep us aware of the negative developments in the world. That is their job. But because it's their job and because they're doing it so well, we manage to get such a negative sense of what is going on in the world. And that is where your research is very important. Sampling, understanding how often things happen, understanding how to draw a causal inference. All of those things are absolutely crucial. So this group, in a very exemplary way, has gone beyond the headlines, and I really do commend you for that. Second, something went off. Yeah. Second is very related, and that is that this group has been involved in producing evidence in a very systematic way. Again, Much of the world of human rights do not deal in systematic evidence. They deal in rhetoric, they deal in persuasion, and they deal in emotion, and they deal sometimes in fear-mongering as well. And this group isn't doing that. That is what I mean by the importance of your contribution to understanding and contributing to the discourse, the world of discourse, the world of policy. The third thing I want to emphasize is that human rights are principles. They are principles, no doubt, but they are principles that have distributive consequences. In that sense, they're like a lot of other policies. So when we deal with human rights advocacy, we are, of course, dealing in the world of principled argumentation, and that has a whole slew of implications to it. For example, it means that we might not want to admit that certain rights should get priority over others. We might not want to admit that there may be a strategic selection of targets. We cling to ideals of universality, and that's a principled position to take. But of course, it becomes important to think of human rights and their impact in terms of policy, because then we will understand other things. We will understand that policies have distributive consequences, and we can expect pushback, okay? So we shouldn't be surprised when we come up against that kind of pushback. Now, another interesting thing that I realized today, and I've always realized this, but I just felt like underscoring it when we sort of talk about social science research on human rights, is this idea of being aware of what funders don't want to fund. So Charles Crabtree mentioned in his presentation that a lot of money was available for studying China, but see if the National Science Foundation will fund censorship of words like science-based policy at the EPA or at the Department of Education. Holly Brem noticed that the NSF, she indicated that the NSF funded her generously to study genocide in Rwanda, but not for studying gun violence in the United States of America. David Suarez is following up his research on foundation and advocacy with the question of what gets funded. And we should be thinking about that, because especially I think in the situation in the United States right now, we need to be very concerned that we are taking a fair view of what our own government is doing. And in that sense, we need to make sure that we have strategies of research and sources of funding that are not overtly constrained. And then finally, I just wanted to make this point. Let's keep our eyes on the prize. And in my view, the prize is outcomes. So what I mean by outcomes is I mean human rights practices around the world. I believe that discourse is important. In fact, I believe that discourse contributes to outcomes. So David Suarez's work on discourse is really very important. Action affects outcomes. And so Chad Clay's work with the Hermes database, I think, is going to be critical information on turning our attention to what just might be that below that line of threshold of reportability in some of the standard sources. So we should include this for finer grained information. And his work was on primarily outcomes, realized human rights. I think one thing I just want to point out maybe, and this is not meant to be critical, it is only a warning, it's all it is that while big data is showing us things we couldn't see before, I think we also need to be a little bit wary of big data answering small questions. So let's just take, again, sort of thinking of our big data project and remind ourselves what we're doing in terms of the ultimate payoff. I fully appreciate that it's going to take step after step after step to get there. We're going to need to carefully spend a lot of time mining big data, but let's don't take our eye off the prize, that the explanations for rights practices are complex, and big data gives us new opportunities to see complexities that perhaps we haven't seen before. But let's re-embed those insights into what I consider to be the prize, understanding ultimately how human rights are practiced around the world. So let me now just turn from these sort of random sets of observations here that are just by way of introducing the topic and sort of get to this idea of a turning point in the area of international human rights, and the idea that we really are at some kind of a turning point. There are two views along these lines. One is expressed in a new book by Stephen Hopgood, Jack Snyder, and Leslie Vinjamuri called Human Rights Futures, an edited volume. I have a piece in it, and I totally push back against them all the time. But their view that what animates this volume is the idea that human rights futures, that they see the world as at a crucial juncture, and that it is at sort of a turning point here now, that rights will either continue to be embedded or will fall backwards into a maelstrom of nationalist backlash, so that there is sort of this sense of being on a precipice, and unless something is done to better understand the world around us and international human rights and the way that it works out around the world, that we are actually going to be going backwards very soon. So I always feel that it is incumbent when I encounter this kind of perspective to just remind us about a few facts about the world. And I think it's okay to do this. Now, you've done big data in a very fine-grained way. Please indulge me for just a moment while I do small data in a very big way. Okay? So there's very general data, but I think we should consider where we have been over the last century. So this, for example, is a picture of battle deaths in state-based conflicts. Human rights are, of course, everybody knows, the place for most human rights violations is in international war. International conflict is the strongest predictor of international human rights violations in almost every regression that I have ever seen. So these are death rates in war. As a matter of history, we seem to be killing each other less than we have done in the past. So basically, what I'm seeing here is that the red is military and civilian. It doesn't show that here, but there is a decrease both in military and civilian death rates and military death rates as well. There's a little bit of an uptick in the last 5 years, at least predicted in the total death rate, and it is interesting to think about what might be contributing to that particular little uptick. But in general, this with a few horrific swells, we're basically seeing that there's been a decline over time. Why this is, I'm not exactly sure. Precise technology, weapons and medical innovations. Daniel Connolly's piece made me think about the technological pieces that might be behind some of these developments. Could it be domestic political constraints on war, law? Hard to say, but the world has changed in a very fundamental way here. This is another set of developments. The political scientists and sociologists in the room are all aware of this, but basically more of the world's population lives under democratic governments now than has been the case over the past 2 decades, and this gives you a sense of that. So this is a sort of, oops. This, what happened? There we go. So this is a picture that you will all be familiar with, and that is just basically that there's been an increase in people living under democracy over time. The ratio of women's to men's wages, if you're interested in gender equality, women's wages are at the highest proportion of a man's in history at the current present in time. It's not great, I'll admit, that women still only make about 80% as much as men do, but it's a lot better than 63%, 63 cents on the dollar for men. And under 5 mortality rates are on the decline. Life expectancy, infant mortality, it's about you are about half as likely to lose your child today as you were in 1990. And that's a big difference. And that is a fundamental improvement in human rights. 100 million children are alive today because of improvements in infant nutrition, vaccination, etc. We haven't said very much about the whole range of children's rights, and we haven't said much about economic, social, and cultural rights. But this is critical as well to keep in mind. So my view is that international human rights progress on the ground has been real. It's been slow. It has been selective. Not every indicator you can imagine has the happy improvements that I've put on these charts, and that it's also fragile. There is absolutely nothing inevitable about what I just showed you. Absolutely nothing at all. It takes political struggle to get to this point. It takes a lot of effort. As you all know, you deal in political science and sociological, social movements, and so it is potentially a fragile situation, as we know as well. So in terms of social science, where do we agree and where do we disagree? I think the first thing is that there is a consensus that I think in human rights research that human rights are important. But I believe that the list of things that we disagree on may be longer than the things that we tend to agree on. There are controversies about who has the authority to pronounce on human rights. Authority debates are rife. Governments define civil rights in different ways. International institutions have some authority, but that authority is increasingly challenged. And one thing that wasn't even mentioned in this conference is that faith communities also do their share to try to shape understandings about what appropriate rights are too. And we are very aware of that worldwide, that it is not just a secular issue, that human rights and the authority to decide what constitutes a right has a lot to do with faith-based understandings as well. What is in the basket of human rights? How do some norms develop? Sometimes it's a matter of how issues are framed. Perhaps that's a short run or a long run thing, I'm not sure, but Brian Grand's work on abortion, Amanda Murdy's work on marriage age, there are important framing effects. And one issue that I think we can all kind of wonder about, are these framing effects very short-term blips, or can they have very long-term consequences for the understanding of international human rights and what is in that basket of rights? What are the consequences of pursuing human rights agenda internationally? That's another very important issue, and the way that this debate goes is a debate over whether the glass is half empty or half full. We've made some progress. We haven't made enough progress, but we've made some progress in these areas. Well, you're an apologist for the situation, for the international system, and the debate tends to go along those lines. We disagree over the role of law in institutions, treaties, even national constitutions. And very interestingly, debates are starting to crop up, as you well know, and some of you have contributed to these debates, about the importance of strategic adaptation to international norms and pressures. The possibility for substitution effects are very important. So for example, Chad Clay's work in the Hermes database, I think, is going to be useful and interesting for trying to look at substitution effects. If one aspect of human rights protection is elevated and enforced, that data could potentially be fine-grained enough that we could see whether other kinds of violations happen in other areas that before our data were not letting us really measure. So substitution effects are important. Now mind you, you can't just throw both of those things into a regression. You need to instead think about how achieving certain international human rights standards may mediate and then spill over into the incentives to substitute. So it's not a matter of tossing these things all into a regression. We have to think very carefully about the methodology that would literally get to substitution. Tactical and strategic choices in the rights community are also very controversial. So there are, as I mentioned, attacks on universalism, that we shouldn't be advocating, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in whole. You must swallow it all right now, and we won't take your progress seriously unless we see that. So universalism has been attacked. Controversies about whether to compromise or whether to demand all rights all the time, whether to appeal to international standards or stay local. Is it more effective to appeal to sort of local traditions rather than international traditions, and under what conditions? Is one of these strategies more appropriate and more effective than the other? And what combination of carrots and sticks are helpful in producing human rights improvements? There's a lot of controversy along those lines as well. Now what I'm going to do is to turn to some areas where I think we actually should be turning some of our attention. Areas where maybe there hasn't been as much attention as we should have possibly. This is just my opinion here, but areas that I think are ripe to study even more. And so the three areas I think I'll sort of mention here, and one of it, and partially because this was framed by Professor So at the very beginning, and also by Keogh, by looking at multilateral institutions and the consequences of these institutions coming under siege. The next, nobody really touched on in this conference, but this is a massively important issue: the effects of economic conditions on the realization of human rights. And then third, I want to offer a slight mea culpa, and I think we need to look very seriously at democracies at risk. Okay, so it used to be that we could assume that democracies had made most of the progress there is to be made. I'm not as sure about that as I used to be. And so I want to suggest that it's important to be thinking about that issue as well. So let's go first to this issue of multilateral institutions under siege and thinking about the issue of backlash. So backlash against multilateral human rights forums, this is something that Leslie Vinjamura and Jack Snyder have been very, very explicit about on a number of occasions. Backlash against human rights is rampant, they argue. The backlash against international justice, and then their favorite target is the International Criminal Court, shows little sign of abating. Now, this is important and interesting because I think we do need to do something very systematic to think about what the discourse has been, positive or negative, around international human rights. And therefore, I think Jeong Woo-Koo's sentiment analysis towards human rights in the Korean news is highly suggestive and actually very important to probably pursue. The finding that negative sentiments towards human rights have increased over time. Where has that negative sentiment come from? What kinds of topics has it been most negative about? But it seems to me that if we want to sort of fully understand the nature of this backlash, we are going to have to do a lot better about listening carefully to the range of voices than to a few pretty prominent criminals in the world. It seems to me that's not the way to understand backlash. Think of it for a minute. What does backlash signify? It's a response to changing conditions. It's a response to accountability pressures. That's what backlash is. It's a response to some kind of threat to your privileged position. So this implies already that human rights are threatening, that their very success is potentially threatening to very important powers. And so one hypothesis could be that human rights backlash is a response to human rights progress. Progress, backlash. Progress, backlash. And so it seems to me that would be one of the key hypotheses to try to understand. One of the key questions is, under what conditions does backlash constitute a net negative for human rights outcomes? In other words, we can tolerate a lot of progress and then a little backlash, but it would be much more harmful if we go only so far and then find so much backlash that on net the progress has been wiped out. So it would be, I think, one very interesting sort of way to think about this backlash issue is whether it is on the margins and we still have net gain, or whether it has actually wiped out some of the improvements that we have seen, and we could go issue area by issue area to try to figure that kind of thing. Is the backlash worse than the pre-rights status quo? I think that's the key question. No backlash scholar I've ever talked to, no one who says there's been so much backlash so we should really rethink human rights in toto, none of them have been able to make the case that the backlash has been so strong that the effort has not been worth it. So backlash in the press is important. There's a need to go beyond heads of state who are the obvious targets of human rights institutions. I mean, we should expect these guys to be saying the ICC is illegitimate. Of course we should expect them to say that. Sort of, good. I'm glad they think so because, they're criminals, basically. Well, at least, maybe not presumptively. I know that's not right. Innocent until proven guilty, et cetera. Okay, so backlash. But I do think what we should be doing is try to localize our understanding of international backlash. Holly Brehm, I think, brought up really good evidence on local law enforcement patterns during the Rwandan genocide. How do the locals think about not only local justice, Holly, but how do they think about international justice? I don't know if you're collecting that information too. I'd be dying to see something like that. viewing local institutions, are they viewed as a legitimate and sort of prior response to international institutions and international justice? And or how does knowledge in each of these areas mutually inform one another? So it might not be, might be only one question to think about which one is seen as more legitimate, but are they in dialogue, and to what extent are they in dialogue with each other, I think is another really, really important, very important question. I actually took a law school class to Columbia this past fall. I taught a course on international humanitarian law, international criminal law, and the peace process in Colombia. And it was very interesting to understand on the ground the perspective that Colombians had about the role that the ICC had played in their domestic process. So it was interesting because on the one hand, there is this idea of positive complementarity where the ICC urges along, and I've written on this, I've said these things. I don't disbelieve what I'm telling you right now, but the ICC urges sort of a more an accountability orientation and a prosecutorial orientation towards international human rights, international crimes. But it backfired a little bit. It backfired a little bit in the context of Colombia because they set up local institutions that would have had the power to basically do what the ICC wants them to do. And then the Supreme Court, essentially the constitutional court of the country, helps to gut those institutions, to take their power away. So there are ways in which sort of thinking about a forceful presence from the outside might not always in every instance be the best strategy. Now, I don't mean to say the ICC was forceful in the sense of really, really forceful, but on several occasions inserted itself in ways that were maybe not exactly helpful in the discussions in Colombia. So we need to be thinking a little bit more about the localization of international backlash. How do the locals think about international norms? Do they view local institutions as a legitimate alternative? And Jim Morrow made this point when he was discussing the analogy to war crimes post-World War II and the Nuremberg and Tokyo cases, in which sort of he was saying that we had really kind of two layers. We had the layer of the international coming from the outside, coming from the victors from the Second World War, but we forget about the entire level of very local processes as well, and we should be thinking about how these mutually inform one another. But while Kenyatta was denouncing the ICC as a racist and colonialist institution, the people of Kenya had a little bit different response, and I don't think I think this is an area worth poking into quite a bit more too, and that is that poll taken during the ICC confirmation charges hearing, during the pretrial hearings, when the charges were presented against the Kenyatta leaders, took place in September and October 2011, and this poll suggests at the time, despite the best efforts of a lot of people of the government in Kenya to dishonor the International Criminal Court, that a lot of people thought this was actually a decent alternative for realizing justice. So whatever you think about this very simplistic presentation of polls, I think what we need to do is understand alternative voices. So when we think of legitimacy, we need to be careful that legitimacy is not defined purely from the mouths of the African Union, that we should be thinking of exploring the ways in which it is also understood by the African people. And we could replicate that around the world again and again. It strikes me that it is important to be thinking not just about what states are saying about international human rights, but how people are experiencing them on the ground as well, and how they're thinking about international law and institutions. I thought it was really interesting, Alyssa Prorock and Ben Appel's investigation of the International Criminal Court, where thinking about human rights violations and thinking through this whole legitimacy question of the court, and their very interesting finding, contrary to what we might hear from those in the very top of the leadership who were targeted by its investigations. Actually, that there's a close correlation between human rights practices on the ground and the cases that the prosecutor decided to take up. So that this question of legitimacy, I think, is ripe for exploring at many, many, many different levels. The next thing I just wanted to sort of put out there in terms of areas for research is to think more about human rights and economic conditions. There is a claim out there. It sometimes comes from governments. It sometimes comes from law professors at the University of Chicago, that rights impede development. So Eric Posner, in that latter category, says that human rights obligations interfere with welfare-promoting activities of the government, and these welfare-promoting activities should be given priority. So he has written an article called Human Welfare, Not Human Rights. Let's pay attention to human welfare. And he sort of sets this up as though we have to make a choice. He sort of puts a false budget constraint on the choice between human rights and development. He argues that states that have given too much attention to human rights have basically worse development outcomes. He argues that that this is a reason for not creating so many international human rights treaties, to distract states away from what the real project ought to be, and that is to develop their economies. So of course, it's also a useful argument for authoritarian regimes that want to ignore human rights during development. There's zero evidence for this. Zero, well, I never say zero, but there's so little evidence for this that I find it shocking in some ways. So let me, and this again, I don't want to pretend like I've done like deep studies on any of this, but I do want to suggest on prima facie there's no evidence for this. And maybe if we dig deeper, we could find some interesting things to discuss along these lines. But here's just a kind of a graph of log of GDP per capita and the number of human rights treaties that you've ratified. These things are going together, not apart, basically. Okay? There's no trade-off. More treaties don't distract states from paying attention to the development of their economy, on average. Okay? Well, what about this budget, this idea of sort of a budget constraint? The idea that if we pay too much attention to human rights, we're crowding out all of our effort with respect to development. There's no evidence at the international level either, if you want to think of an augmented budget constraint on your choice between human rights and development, because the international community is putting a ton of effort into development relative to human rights. So, there's just on its face, it doesn't seem plausible to me. But theoretically, it doesn't seem plausible to me either. What else comes with human rights? Rule of law, strong judicial institutions. Some of these things are likely to travel together. Some of the rights that we might sort of be considered, sort of pesty treaty rights, actually are pro-development. Educating your children is pro-development. Using the other half of your population, the female half, educating them, giving them employment opportunities is pro-development. So on its face, it strikes me as an untenable claim, but I think we should do research on it nonetheless. And I think we should do research on it because it is a claim out there, and it's made in more than one venue. It's made both in sort of conservative circles in the United States, and it's of course made by developmentally oriented governments who have put human rights second. There's another another question relating to international human rights and economic conditions that I think is worth thinking about too. And we haven't given this one too much thought, but it strikes me as a really fruitful area. And that is to think about how support for human rights may crumble under bad economic conditions. So we have not situated almost anything we've said in the economy. We've not situated almost anything we've said about the willingness to respect the rights of other people when the pie is shrinking. So I think this is worth looking at too, although I will state that it is also the case historically that rights about social and economic guarantees actually began to be discussed in a very serious way in the United States and Europe during the worst depression in history. At a time when unemployment rates in the United States were about 25%, when more than 11 million people were looking for work, when there was no visible means of support, which instilled fear, imposed want, and more than anything else, humiliated people who were unemployed. And yet at this time, it seems that a coalition could be formed to talk about access to income, to health care, to food, and to housing as something like a right that human beings had. And so that was the language that developed around the New Deal. It had rights language in it. And it's interesting that that is also the experience that gave rise to a coalition of states supporting the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights after the Second World War, although the United States took an extraordinarily wimpy position on that and really argued that there was, in that venue, because Eleanor Roosevelt was constrained by politics back home, but argued in that venue that basically there were, that the United States didn't believe in economic rights. So I think there's a lot to do here that is really very interesting. A systematic examination of macroeconomic trends. What is the relationship between rights progress and practice and business cycles or inequality? The micro mechanisms. Do preferences for human rights vary by class? Do individuals' preferences vary when they face economic hardships? Do individuals' preferences vary in the context of sociotropic hardships? I'm just reading something very interesting right now that makes me think that this is well, for a number of reasons, I think this is a really important way to go. But I'm reading a really interesting book right now by Ibram Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning. Has anybody looked at that book or heard of it? Very interesting book. It's about a history of racism in the United States. And his claim is that racism is not about hatred. Instead, it's about economic interest. And then you make up the racism to justify what would be to your economic advantage. And if that is the case, then we need to think seriously about the relationship between economic transition and change and racism, exclusion, and othering in the United States and elsewhere around the world. So it strikes me that is a really, really fruitful way to go. And I thought Paul Chang's work on intercultural marriage suggested something to me here, that these intercultural marriages, though they are running up against some important social discrimination, they could fare even worse under economic pressure rather than the fairly recent good times. So I just thought that's something we really need to think about. And why do we need to think about it? Not only is the pie shrinking, but the pie is being divided in ways that eventually people are going to get pretty upset about. So this is pre-tax income growth in the United States. I think we're all familiar with the huge inequality. Where are we? I guess you and I are probably here. Would that be fair? A few of you might be here. And a couple of you, maybe if you're not tenured, you might be here. I don't know. But you know what? We're not enjoying the major gains in the vibrant economy, okay? The major gains are increasingly going, of course, to the very top of the economic heap. And this shows up, of course, in family wealth, too. And family wealth, by the way, in contrast to income, family wealth is passed on generation to generation. And so family wealth, you find the same kind of disparities. This is showing now growth over time, but disparities in family wealth. If you were discriminated against and couldn't buy housing in a good area 40 or 50 years ago, your family will be in a fundamentally different situation than an ethnic group who could have purchased a house in an area that was on the economic upswing. So that's a really, really important difference and a very, very important thing to keep in mind. The consequences, of course, are important. This is just the example of homelessness around the world and overcrowded in substandard housing. But I also wonder if the more we feel ourselves threatened, the more we are willing to other those around us. So is there a relationship between economic inequality, insecurity, nationalist sentiment, and the toleration and the tolerance of human rights violations? It strikes me we should be exploring that kind of, and some work I'm doing is looking at the tendency to want to put up physical barriers between countries. So instances in which we increasingly are erecting physical barriers, which themselves, you better believe it, create human rights violations too, as some people that are highly motivated try to circumvent these kinds of structures. So that sort of gives us a sort of sense of what may be at stake, I think, as the economy starts to change. And as we are in a period of transition, economic, structural transition, that is a once-in-a-lifetime transition. It may be once in every 2 lifetimes kind of a transition, but it's big and it's important, and I think there's going to be impact on the way human rights happen. Now the next thing, the final point I really want to make is somewhere else we ought to be thinking is democracies at risk. There's been an assumption in the human rights literature that democracies have nailed human rights and there's sort of nowhere else for them to go, and I quote myself here, because in the book I wrote in 2009, I basically said that countries, polities, that the people that live in a democratic polity have no particular motive to mobilize for human rights because they already enjoy human rights. And I said, so they don't have the motive, and I said people who live in autocracies don't have the means, that they would be subject to such harsh repression that they don't have the means to mobilize. And so that you could expect most mobilization for human rights in transitional settings or partial democracies. And I just would like to sort of think again about the ways in which democracies may very well be at risk for human rights violations. And so some of the things that were said in this conference today helped me think about that. One was the issue of security risks. So Jeffrey Wallace's work with Yonatan Lupu shows us that the public is not as committed. 3 democracies. But the public is not perhaps as committed to human rights in these 3 democracies as we thought they were when they're presented with some kind of a security threat. So that's one. Threats during economic transformations, which I just alluded to. Inequity, exclusion, which I just alluded to. And I think very important in democratic countries is the issue that we are bombarded with so much often incoherent information that we do not know what our rights are. We do not know when they're being violated. We might not even know when they're being violated in our names, as the United States of America, for example. So here's sort of an interesting example. Authoritative incoherence when it comes to what is the law, what are your rights, what are human rights. Okay, so just to sort of think about this. Donald Trump says, I'd bring back waterboarding, and I'd bring back a hell of a lot worse than waterboarding. He said it in 2016 as a candidate, and he's repeated very similar language as the president. And then we have, on the other hand, someone else who's, in my view, very authoritative when it comes to torture. The president can sign whatever executive order he likes, but the law is the law, and we're not bringing back torture in the United States of America. And so how do we understand the sort of conflict of authoritative cues, important political figures from the same political party, some of which appeal to law, others who appeal not necessarily to law and sometimes against law? How do we understand in a democracy how to respond to this kind of incoherent sort of sets of cues that we might be getting with respect to the issue of torture? And this is a really important issue in my view because it has a lot to do, I think, for consequences for security. Torture, in my view, and it's been shown in many studies, promotes violent extremism. It degrades alliances. There are many knock-on consequences. So this is not only, although this would be enough, but it is not only that the individual is being tortured, again, enough, but it has all kinds of knock-on consequences that we should be thinking about. And actually, Hyunjun Kim's research kind of reminded me a little bit of this kind of incoherent authority problem, this idea that there are different human right truths under different kinds of governments, that supposedly both of them are sort of showing us the truth of the situation. But in fact, they're coming up with some very important different conclusions. Well, one of the things that I think is interesting to think about is how do we think about, in a democratic country that's ratified a lot of treaties, how do we think about the issue of our revered political leaders staking a claim that is clearly contrary to an international legal obligation? How do we think about that? And what is one to do in a democratic setting where these cues are coming and they contradict each other? Well, I started to think about that a little bit and started a study kind of along those lines. So I did a little bit of a torture experiment. The first part is, this is very, very familiar for those of you who have kind of looked at the experimental work in the area of torture. So there's a cue basically that currently there's a debate about whether the United States should consider using severe forms of psychological and physical abuse, such as waterboarding and other coercive techniques in interrogations of detainees. Currently, the United States government does not allow the use of such methods for intelligence collection. Now, what if we gave people an international law cue, such as these forms of abuse are outlawed by the Convention Against Torture, a legally binding international treaty to which the United States is committed, and then give them the presidential cue? Okay, so we can treat them separately with each one of these, and we can treat them jointly with both pieces of information that our president has advocated the use of torture, essentially. And then ask, do you think that the US should refrain from using severe psychological and physical forms of detainee abuse, even if it makes it more difficult to collect intelligence information from detainees? We can do sort of a similar thing with We can do sort of a similar things with a refugee experiment as well. One interesting thing about this president, he gives us a lot of opportunities to compare contradictory signals. And so this is one of those opportunities in which all of our subjects could receive information that there's a debate about whether the United States should limit the entry of refugees from certain predominantly Muslim countries, give the international law treatment, give the presidential treatment. And again, we can have 4 different groups here. A group gets nothing, one gets one gets the other, and one gets both, and try to figure out whether how it has any influence on this question. Okay, so I'm not going to give you values. I'm not going to give you p-values. This is not this kind of a talk, is it? But one thing that we are finding is quite interesting, and that is I'll just give you the bottom line, what we're finding so far. It's about as far along as some of you who are in the earliest stages of your research that you did today. This is about how far this research is. But basically what we're finding here is that international legal commitments affect policy preferences, primarily among Democrats, in refugee policy, but not for torture policy. It doesn't move things very much. That when the president advocates a policy, and this is the interesting thing, it doesn't affect their preferences per se over policy, but partisans come to believe it's legal even when we tell them it's not. So there is something I think we could call or think about as motivation bias here, that political leaders potentially have the ability to nullify information about the status of legality, at least among their supporters. And so it doesn't affect their preferences about torture per se, but it does suggest that leaders are in a very, very powerful position to sort of change the truth of what people understand, at least among partisans. And so I think that's at least suggestive that in democracies we are not free and clear. We can be manipulated just as well. And there are important conditions under which I think we should at least consider democracies to be under threat as well. And that, I think, should be one of our big challenges for research going forward. So just to skip that one more time. And then the final thing I just want to put out there is that we should be thinking long and hard about the diffusion of human rights values. We should be thinking, I think, about the consequences of US disengagement. What happens when international law and institutions come under severe criticism, even from a liberal hegemon? And I think we should be, therefore, looking at the language of emulative justification. If the United States makes excuses or Europe starts to make excuses for their treatment of individuals and groups' human rights, is that language then echoed throughout the world? The language of rhetorical diffusion, of international terrorism, of all kinds of external threats. And it's suggestive to me, I think, that we should be cautious when we see this kind of language potentially rippling throughout the world about the position that the United States takes. What happens when once-in-a-lifetime economic transformations shake politics around the world from the US to China? You know, if rights demands increase with development and ebb when the pie gets shrinking and smaller and the entitled start to feel insecure, we might expect, for example, increased labor demands in China as they start to become economically empowered. We might increasingly look for class struggle, racism, and other forms of othering in the United States as the pie starts to shrink, or as it is experienced as shrinking if you are in that lower 40% that has seen your income go nowhere over the years. How do people process the changes and contradictions that they're hearing and that they're experiencing? These are all very crucial things to be thinking about as we think about the spread of human rights around the world. And I'll just end on a final note, and that is, in the end, it's important, I think, to communicate with the public and practitioners. Let me go back to what I started with when I began this talk, and that is that this room is in a very special position. You have the skills to show us the best inferences. We don't always have truth, but we come a lot closer, I think, than the random selection. Now, you know, not the random, but the media, the way the media feeds us headlines, or the way our politicians choose to portray things. I think you have a better handle on all that, and you can contribute in ways that people around the world would very much, I think, benefit from. And I would just ask you, as you develop in your academic careers, I know many of you are very young, some of you less so, but especially to the young ones in the audience, as you develop in your academic careers, I hope you have the courage and the will and the interest to start saying something to broader audiences about what you're finding. It's a world out there, not here, out there, often devoid of real facts as we know them in social science. So I really hope that you feel like you can contribute to those kinds of conversations as your career advances. And I find this to be kind of an inspiring thought in closing. You may not win every battle. You know, think of every paper you present as a battle, I suppose, in some way. But if you lose the war of ideas, you will have lost the war. You may lose every battle, but if you win the war of ideas, you will have won the war. My deepest fear and your greatest problem is that you might not be winning the war of ideas. And for you, the war of ideas is not a matter of biased ideological understandings. It's what we can produce from social science. So I would ask you, whenever you get the chance, and when you feel you have the opportunity to do it, try to make your research as accessible as you can. Try to fill that void of sort of hollow and false information that we often find out there. Thank you very much.
Time for some questions?
Okay. Are there selection effects?
So, hi, Chad Clay. I really enjoyed your talk. It was really interesting. Lots of ideas there. Back on the topic of economic growth, economic opportunities, and human rights, something I struggle with a lot of my research is a lot of my research is on that topic, and the balance between the necessity of economic resources for human rights respect and all the things you pointed out, that respect for human rights can yield economic growth in all of these different ways, independent judiciaries and women's rights, and all of these things are related to it. I think one thing that we have to struggle with a little bit is, one, the degree to which we've assumed in our research that civil and political rights do not require economic resources for their full enjoyment, which just doesn't bear out in basically any kind of research we do. and the degree to which economic, social, and cultural rights are treated as if they are impossible unless you have achieved the greatest level of economic outcomes. So I'm just curious as to how you see your thoughts on how we should position our discourse in talking about this sort of problem and this trade-off in light of people making what I agree with you are on their face kind of ridiculous arguments about human rights relationship with economic outcomes.
Yeah. Well, I think one way to start thinking about it is, first of all, to think about what kinds of rights actually are out of reach economically for the time being, and which ones are not. And a lot of them simply are not. Civil and political rights are out of reach, but not out of reach, but are not costless, is what I meant to say. They are not costless. But there might be some things that a government could do fairly immediately that would not be terribly costly. Rescinding discriminatory laws, for example. That might be one thing. And then I guess you could ask, but how do you enforce them? And then it would require a court that's willing to enforce them, right? But the initial steps could potentially be not all that expensive. So they're not costless, but it might be best to, it might be a decent idea to start thinking that way. The next step is to start thinking about human rights that actually provide economic benefits. So education is so clearly one of those. Healthcare is so clearly one of those. So some of them clearly support the development progress. And so that would be another way to be thinking about that. Now, another way to position ourselves is to say, we're not going to sort of get into that rights are rights whether or not they contribute. And that's what I meant about the strategic debates about, sort of what tactics we're going to choose, the debates about how strategic we want to be and what tactics we're going to choose when we advocate for human rights. So that's another sort of issue to be thinking about, is this whole concern about if I start to talk like I'm willing to make cost-benefit analyses, what does that say when there really is something that no matter what the cost, you want to make sure you pursue? So you have to be thinking about that difficulty as well. Yeah. So I'm not sure I would argue and go all the way down the road of cost-benefit analysis on this. Yes.
So first, thank you for such an inspiring talk. It really was inspiring. I guess my question is about a small theme that came up in your talk but wasn't really explored that well. It's about, this sort of goes back to Amanda's paper about cultural resonance. There is an argument out there, at least in East Asia, that the human rights itself as a concept is based on Western individualism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that won't resonate in East Asia because especially the word demanding human rights is such, contentious or confrontational way of going about it. And so there is, at least in some cases like in China, maybe in South Korea, maybe in Japan, that the whole issue of human rights have to be framed in a different way for it to culturally resonate. Some people might think of that as a compromise, that we're actually compromising, and cultural resonance really means, or Chinese-style democracy really means authoritarianism, et cetera. But the other argument is that unless you do that, it's really not going to take hold fundamentally if we think about culture as some fundamental structure. And so I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly the kind of thing we should be doing research into, is what sorts of framings of rights have more cultural resonance. And are there any anthropologists here? Sally Engle-Mary has done work on this, she does cultural anthropology in a transnational way. And her work looks at, it's not, it's done through ethnography, and it basically looks at the language that is developed by a particular sector or group that has an authentic foot both locally and transnationally, and has kind of status in both the local community and the transnational community. And she argues that they act as translators and help to take these sort of global norms, which are ill-fitting, of course, for the local context, but that can be reframed in ways that make it more acceptable in the sort of local set of concerns and local understandings of rights. But primarily, I think she makes the argument that in terms of the local sets of concerns, because if people sort of hear a tool or a way of thinking about how to better claim something they're interested in, whether it's framed as a right or something else, they'll often be quite interested in it. So that's an interesting sort of way to think about it as a project in cultural translation. Ian.
So I had a question for an outsider to this literature. I'm wondering, what's sort of the latest news on linking human rights to other types of international cooperation, like, you know, and so the thing I'm thinking about here is the kind of material spillovers or externalities associated with protections of human rights in a foreign country are a little bit less compared to like an environmental agreement or
So you
a
mean
trade
like the
agreement.
carrots and sticks?
Yeah, exactly. So what's the state of the literature and practice when it comes to trying to influence countries' human rights
There's
practices?
a super long literature on this. And I think the most recent literature has kind of still struggled to sort of really properly identify what the relationships are. But I think there is some evidence that human rights agreements that have got, trade agreements and economic agreements that have got some pieces of some obligations with respect to human rights are better at achieving human rights than nothing at all, and better than trade agreements that do not contain human rights and human rights agreements that have no enforcement mechanisms. So that kind of research, though, has suffered from the problem that there are selection effects into these agreements in the first place. So I think that's something that is still debated, basically, long debated about what some of those consequences are of trying to link human rights with trade. But I do think that actually this question has sort of made its way into a lot of the bigger concerns about what happens now, you know, that Europe is starting to feel tension and the United States is not, you know, protecting human rights anymore, is that this whole concern that we've sort of, the states that have the tools to do anything about human rights enforcement are not using them in the same kinds of ways. Although, in some cases, actually I should back up. I should say that the human rights literature has pretty well shown that you have to be a small country to be influenced by these kinds of agreements. China's never been particularly easy to manipulate with trade agreements, and that's why the United States Congress gave it up and decided that it wasn't something that was worth the policy to try to pursue, that they would use other, you know, so that the whole agreement about sort of giving up, withholding MFN from China in the hopes of getting human rights improvements has been given up as a strategy. So I think it's really highly contingent on the size of the country you're talking about. So for very small, very dependent countries, it's a potentially useful, but sort of not on average. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So you mentioned that there's an argument that says that human rights treaties can create a backlash against perceived imperialism, which might undermine the efforts to promote human rights. But I feel there's another mechanism by which the ICC raises the costs of losing power for an autocrat and encourages autocrats to stay in power whatever the cost. So I was wondering if you think that there is an argument, or how persuasive you find this argument that sometimes justice can work against the promotion of human rights, and where you stand on that.
I think it's hard to dislodge autocrats generally. And I have not been terribly persuaded that the threat of an ICC prosecution has kept them in power much longer than they would have tried to cling on to anyway. So I don't know. I don't feel like it's a substantively really significant impact in that way. And largely because I think that a lot of autocrats would have tried to hang on for as long as they could anyway. I think, you know, sort of what is the counterfactual is really, really hard to establish in these cases. So I think there might be some cases, there might be a case or two where that's been the dynamic, but again, it's really hard to sort of say that that's been an important first order or even second order impact of the International Criminal Court. But, you know, I don't know, I don't know, what do you guys think? Is that very persuasive? I hear those arguments made. I know a few cases are brought up, and I don't find them terribly resonant myself. But do you?
Somewhat, sometimes. So maybe the ICC is not the institution that really matters in those cases. But I feel that if you think about the Arab Spring, so Ben Ali in Tunisia had a clear exit. He could go to Saudi Arabia, and he's still safe. He's not. He didn't die. Whereas in the case of Assad, it seems like maybe if he had had a clear exit or some safe passage out. That's a wild counterfactual.
Yeah, that's
maybe
a wild card, yeah. I think another answer to that might be that maybe it does depend on the alternatives. If the alternative is to eventually be brought down by domestic forces, you're going to have a little more of a Gaddafi kind of an outcome, and it's better to end up in The Hague than it is to end up in the sewer pipe, right? So it's hard to say in general, basically. And I suppose maybe it does. Maybe for a very calculating dictator, he or she thinks about all of their alternatives and tries to decide whether it's worth turning themselves in or not. Or whether they can be turned in from, by other forces, not turning themselves in. Although there have been several indictees who have taken themselves to the International Criminal Court, turned themselves in.
Thanks so much for being here. So in political science, I know for obvious reasons, a lot of human rights research is focused in international relations, looking at treaties, transnational networks, international interventions. What do you see as opportunities or any new exciting work from more of a comparative lens of studying the effects of domestic human rights defenders on human rights compliance, or exploiting subnational variation to look at the effects of domestic human rights advocacy on human rights?
No, I think there's a lot of room for that right now, and especially within the United States. So some of the things that I'd like to see much more attention be paid to are things like treatment of refugees into the United States, treatment of migrants, sort of understanding, sort of how for one thing, a very interesting thing is that if you sort of do free association of words with the public and you sort of say, alien, what's the word that they think of in America? Illegal. Absolutely, it's the first word. So there's a tendency to criminalize people who are in the United States without papers, who are not documented. Strictly speaking, they're not criminals. They have not committed a crime. They're in the United States undocumented, but they have not committed a crime by coming into the United States. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that can and should be done, thinking about how others, outsiders, get kind of framed in American discourse and what that means for human rights. Right now it seems to me like that is one of the more fruitful areas in the United States. It's also really interesting to think about how certain things become framed as rights in the United States or in any country we could think of. So it's just, that whole issue about gun rights, for example, is just really fascinating. That it's been framed as a right to bear arms as an individual right, and it is not balanced in the way many other rights are balanced against the right not to be subject to violence, gun violence. So the framing of those kinds of issues, I think, is there's a lot of opportunity to do interesting research there. Yeah, the U.S. is a wonderful place, I think, to be. I think it really is time to kind of turn inward, and it's this whole idea of looking inward to democracies and finding the shortcomings. I think that's really crucial. Ultimately, the result of doing that might be to strengthen the international human rights regime. If it turns out that major powers that call themselves democratic can be more introspective, get their own rights improved and get in order, it might improve their legitimacy, basically.
I've never been able to get my arms around the issue of religion and human rights. For instance, some human rights call for freedom of religion, but yet some religions call for oppression of women. Can you share some thoughts on that and how it can clarify that for me?
Yeah, freedom of religion is one of the central things that the United States has worked globally and consistently for. When we won't necessarily fight for a whole list of other rights, freedom of religion is really one of the strong ones, and it's not hard to understand why that is. It's because there's very organized groups in the United States that want to freely practice their religious advocacy in countries around the world. So the U.S. has always been, really very supportive of this idea of freedom of religion. But the way I think about religion is that it is a source of authority. In fact, it is the ultimate source of authority for most people, is their religion, not their government. A lot of people, in some cases, they're very, very closely mixed, right? But in secular societies, these are very distinct kinds of things. And so their conscience takes their understanding of human rights from their religion. If religions are strong on anything, it is the organization of the family, and it is attitudes towards human life. And so religions have an awful lot to say about the power structures in families, the relationship between men and women in the family structure, and have a lot to say, for example, about the role of parents raising their children. And this has made its way into conservative American discourse, and I'm sure in many, many other places as well. But I'll speak right now for conservative American discourse. And that's one of the reasons why the United States is right now, I think, the only country in the world that's not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is because of the very sort of strong ideas about children as being subject to the authority of the family in a very clear way. That conservatives are concerned of giving away that authority to any secular power at all, but especially to the United Nations. And so an alternative discourse starts to develop that says, you have a primary obligation to understand the rights of the child as embedded in the family, as understood by religious tenets. I should say one other thing about the Convention on the Rights of the Child is it does have a freedom of religion for children clause. Is that ever irritating to almost every major religion that views parents as being the authoritative figures with respect for their child's religious upbringing? And no, a child does not have freedom of religion. Are you crazy? You're going to church until you're 18 anyway, And so to me, this is just one of those areas in which you have conflicting authoritative notions of what constitutes a right. It's almost surprising and almost shocking to me that the right to freely practice religion would have made it into the CRC. It's just so obviously problematic for any country in the world that literally takes these obligations seriously and doesn't have some kind of overarching exception to them, which is the case with most Muslim countries with respect to international human rights treaties who have these sort of overarching reservations with respect to Sharia law, that everything in this treaty is subject to Sharia law. So that means, we'll interpret this the way we want to interpret it. So it is hard to get your head around, except that we have sort of religious authorities here. They are underrepresented in international and secular fora. In the United States, they are intentionally kept separate and distinct. In the international fora, they weren't very well represented when it comes to kind of setting up this kind of secular area of international human rights. And their ideas didn't make it into these treaties. And so you're stuck with kind of conflicting ideas about the authority over various kinds of freedoms. That's the only way I know how to explain that. Conflicting authorities. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I have the microphone.
Oh, sorry, you do it. You do it.
I'll be quick. I have a couple quick questions. Thank you for the fantastic presentation. The two quick questions. The first question should probably be directed to either Hopgood or Posner. But I'm wondering so you actually have some interaction with them, so I just wanted to know if you have any insight on this topic. So they were gleefully calling out the hypocrisy of the West, the US, Europe, and others. And they had good reasons to do that. But now a lot of regimes, including the current regime here, have taken advantage of that and really, okay, so if you're calling out the hypocrisy, well, we'll just completely withdraw from commitment to human rights if you call it that hypocrisy. And Trump, I think President Trump said in defending Vladimir Putin, Putin, I think it was the interview with Bill O'Reilly, Bill O'Reilly said something to the effect of, Putin's a killer, and Trump said, we killed too, right? So it's kind of acknowledging the violation that U.S. government does. So that's kind of what Hopgood and Posner wanted to be acknowledged, and they kind of won that battle. So I wonder where they are in their thinking. Are they happy? Are they reveling in the acknowledgement of the hypocrisy of the West? I mean, I doubt it, but I wonder what you might have to say about it.
Honestly, who knows, how happy they are. But let me just say one thing about that, and that is, and this is why it's important to do the social science that we are all doing in this room. They have very much gotten attention for their positions. So this is, I think, really, really critical, is that there is a discourse out there that is sort of unencumbered by systematic evidence, right? And is willing to criticize, which we all should be doing, we should all be criticizing, but then without sort of thinking about what might be done to alleviate some of those criticisms. And that is the next step in sharing our findings, is to say, how can this constructively be used for good purposes? For purposes that we find to be ethically satisfying purposes, basically. At some point, social scientists, it's okay, once you've done the hard work of the basic research, it is okay to be normative. It really is. Once you've done the hard work of the basic science, it is okay to be normative. And it seems to me that if we're willing to take that step, we can counter some of that kind of attention getting slash and burn sort of discourse that is out there.
Great.
Although criticism is important, I don't want to be misunderstood to be sort of saying that we should be apologists for the West, or that we should minimize rights violations in the West. We should not.
Yeah. Quickly, the second question. So I look back at your first book as I try to introduce you, and this is kind of a stretch and it's a wild question, but I wonder if there's any parallel between the defection from the gold standard in the 1920s, 30s, and some kind of defection from human rights principles today. And if not, I want to hear that there's no parallel between them. And if so, can you give us why we don't have to worry about a new Beth Simmons studying how certain countries defected from human rights principles 20 years down the line? Yeah.
So there is one parallel, and that is that the United States took sort of a special privileged unilateral position in both of these time periods. So with respect to supporting the gold standard, the United States stayed on the gold standard up until the early 1930s, and then just said, and some people argue this was the right economic move, by the way, that basically if in our own interest, we're going to deflate our currency, and you all can adjust out there to that. But that had also some negative impacts on neighbors. It was done unilaterally, not in a coordinated fashion. Are there parallels till now? Well, is the United States working with allies to try to find a steady state solution, or to try to support this regime, try to achieve common objectives without sort of creating massive instability or questioning? Well, it's the same kind of thing. There's kind of a unilateral position that the United States has taken. I think if the United States continues to not support these regimes of human rights, though, that the judgment will be very different. Whereas some see the United States stepping off of the gold standard as something that eventually helped to inflate and helped to pull the rest of the world out of the Depression, though at the price of putting a lot of externalities on other countries, but kind of helped to buoy the US economy and increase demand in the United States, stimulate price rises in the United States. Perhaps that was to the good. I'm not sure that the same judgment will be if the United States doesn't support the international human rights regime. But I think this is something that requires, I think, a lot of further work. We don't even know for sure yet. What are the consequences of the US not supporting international human rights? I'm not sure we know the answer to that. Again, one interesting thing would be to watch US language diffuse around the world, US justifications for violation diffusing around the world. What would be the consequence if the United States sort of visits China and never mentions the word human rights, or congratulates Mr. Putin on his wonderful election? What are the consequences of that for authoritarian regimes? There must be a systematic way for us to explore how US words and deeds reverberate in this space. So far, at a gut level, I feel like it's sort of it's going to have a negative consequence. But perhaps not. Maybe we're not as important as I think we are, actually. Maybe that's just the case.
All right. Thanks for so much for this inspiring talk. I just want to mention human rights issues of Korea because this is really politicized. For example, this current government is a liberal government, and this government improves upon human rights issues in many unprotected segment of society. So it's good. But surprisingly, this government, liberals in general, are quite silent on human rights issues of North Koreans. Because if they have to talk about human rights issues on North Koreans, they have to attack on this dear leader. And that's not good, because this liberal government is traditionally pro-North, and therefore they want to want to be silent on this human rights abuse that is happening in North Korea. So I'm a little confused, because in South Korea they voice human rights protections for many people, but on the other hand they don't want to talk about human rights protections for North Koreans. But again, it's also politicized from other perspectives that, for example, United States and South Korean conservatives try to raise this issue of human rights abuses in North Korea, because that'll give them some justification to attack on this North Korean regime, eventually maybe overthrow the regime. So I mean, it's human rights issues. I think it's totally politicized in that sense. So I'm wondering.
And that bothers you, doesn't it? Yeah. And you know why it bothers you? It's because, while I said that human rights is a policy area with distributive consequences, we can't get around the fact that it is also a moral issue, and it's very hard to make concessions and to not call out inconsistency with respect to moral positions. So we find it sort of easy to tolerate, well, we find it easy to tolerate that the United States has a special trade relationship with Canada and Mexico, but not so much with Indonesia, for example, right? Or we have a special security relationship with South Korea and not so much a whole host of other countries. So that we can understand. Those aren't issues that we imbue with this ethical kind of concern, and we don't demand consistency. That's just a matter of, yeah, that's in our interest, right? That's in our interest. Human rights are different in that way. And because they do touch on the moral and normative element, we seem to have who's we in that sentence? People, research this. People have an expectation of consistency with human rights, right? They expect that to be consistent in ways they don't expect your trade policy to be consistent necessarily. So part of it is the nature of the issue area. And it's a troubling one for exactly that reason. This is exactly why advocacy groups have difficulty with being universalistic all the time. They want to be universalistic. All rights everywhere, all the time, no exceptions. So even if it's very sensitive to talk about gay rights in the Middle East, advocacy groups feel like it's important to do so, or in Africa, okay? And they feel like that's an important thing to hang on to and not give up on. And I think that's because, you know, there's this sort of sense that a human right is something that inheres in the human being. And we're not willing to sacrifice that in general for some other goal. In the area of torture, we're never willing to. So we have a treaty that does not admit of any derogation under any circumstances. But I guess I would say, if one wanted to be more sympathetic to the progressive government, the question would be, for what purpose? For what purpose? That's a sympathetic way to ask the question to the progressive government. What are you trying to achieve? If you could somehow create good enough relationships on the Korean Peninsula that the nuclear tension and the military tension could be drastically reduced, would it be worth it? Yeah. So that's the issue, is that, we just hate doing that. But every once in a while, something might be worth it.
Okay, last one. Yeah. Okay, Chang No-so from Korea University. Thank you very much for your good speech, and also thank you for mentioning the point made in the morning in your speech. I want to share with my concerns and frustrations with you, and I just want to know how you feel about it. Actually, it's related to a little bit of what Professor Wang said a minute ago. I think there are to simplify it, there are two different kinds of human rights policies. Okay, the first is human rights policies to promote and protect people, and human rights of people. And second is policy to use the human rights in order to pursue some other objective. Okay.
Give us an example of the second.
Use the human rights toward the human rights policy towards North Korea, as Humphrey mentioned, or human rights policy towards China. Okay, they use the human rights in order to achieve some economic, negotiations, for example.
In this case, I guess not using human rights, right? Not mentioning human rights.
Yeah, okay. That's another type of human rights policy, I think.
Yeah.
Then most policies are second. It's very difficult to see the completely politically neutral human rights policies, in my opinion. And I think it is too naive to. I've been thinking about. I have a North Korean human rights activist for 20 years. And there are a lot of frustrations out of it. And I continue to argue that we need to be politically neutral, and we need to see the human rights as a universal value in order to achieve the goal to promote and protect human rights. But there's I cannot say no, but very few human rights policies that is politically neutral and pursue the only human rights. Then, one comment I want to make is we talk about the relationship between human rights and development, and human rights and welfare, whatever. And I agree with you, obviously. I teach about this, and it's obviously human rights is very important for the development. We cannot see the opposite. But particularly scholars, Western scholars, need to be careful, because many policies are based on the research of the social science, which is very politically neutral. And based on that research, they pursue the policies. But policies can be pursued differently, intentionally or unintentionally. They use word of human rights, not for the purpose of promoting human rights, but some other purposes. So I think the researchers also need to realize that their researches can be used differently. Throughout my experience, I think it's very important to understand that environment. I want to seek for your your comments on this.
No, I have to agree with you on the second point. Is that really is a risk we run? Is that our findings are our findings. And our findings are not always what we would have liked them necessarily to be. We report them anyway as social scientists, and sometimes they're not what we normatively would have preferred. And then that becomes, if we put our research out there and try to make it policy relevant, then we run the risk that we supported a policy that we basically have questions about, or not, basically for normative reasons, sort of don't support. And that is a risk to run. And it's one of the tensions I think we're all going to run into if there are findings that are not what we had sort of hoped for, perhaps. Because when it comes right down to it, most of us, when we start our research, are not the perfectly neutral social science, because we have hopes for human rights too, right? We have sort of a sense of how important human rights are. But that is a risk we run, is that our findings will be used in ways we don't want to find them. We don't want them to be used for. So any different from human rights from environmental politics, or any different in economic findings or anything else? I think this is always the risk that researchers are going to run, that they will sometimes be, lots of possibilities. You won't find what you wanted to find, but you can't retract. You can't just be selective about putting out there what you want to put out there if you found something you didn't like or what have you. You can be misused, you can be misunderstood. So the best we can do is to be as clear as we can be about how we did our research, transparent, fair, be as clear as we can possibly be about what we found and what we didn't find, and then, do the best we can to influence policy. And that's the problem that everybody finds if they are in this kind of world where they want to try to do social science work that they hope will go beyond the conference walls, right? So it's frustrating, but that's the way it is.
Right. On
Thank
that
you.
note, please
Yep.
join me in thanking Professor Beth Simmons.
Thank you.
Now we have Professor John Woo Koo for some closing remarks.
Well, my name is Jung-woo Koo. For people who didn't come to morning session, sociology professor at Sungkyunkwan University, South Korea, and the manager of SSK Human Rights Forum, which is one of the organizers. And I was actually afraid that we didn't spend much of time talking about the role of human rights education, how to spread the ideas of human rights and how to transform people. That being said, I think Beth Simmons really demonstrated nicely, showed us how to transform ourselves and how to engage in transformative learning with the kinds of knowledge we've shared for today. And then Beth really did an excellent job in piecing pieces together in such a way as to identify similarities and differences among the works that have been presented. I was struck by the fact that you really remembered pretty much everything. Mentioning about every presentation that was made. As far as I know, there was no exception. Everybody was mentioned, including myself. I was scared to death. What if Beth doesn't mention about my work, but you did? Sentimental analysis. Thanks for mentioning about that. I think Kyo mentioned about the fact that when we thought about who's going to be the person who will deliver the keynote speech, and Beth Simmons came up, first, and there was nobody else, and then we felt compelled to invite Beth Simmons, thinking of her as the best person who can really synthesize the kinds of works we put together. And that the belief we had a couple months ago, actually last fall, 2017, remains exactly the same. I think Kyo would be with me right now. And then one more thing I want to mention is that Beth Simmons really delivered a tremendous level of optimism, right? Just like after mentioning about negativity, like spreading around the world, like in the name of backlash against human rights and pushback against human rights. I think you nicely practiced. Pushing back against the pushback by showing us an incredible level of optimism. I think that was the other way of practicing transformative learning, I guess. And then the other thing is that you really sounded like half political scientist and half sociologist, mentioning a lot about how economic conditions would play in terms of shaping human rights politics and talking about demographic changes, mortality data, inequality data, I felt like, is she really a political scientist? Like, I felt like you must be a sociologist. I really appreciate that part as well. I think, looking back, if you think about the kinds of things we did for the entire day, was that we actually trying to debunk the conventional way of doing human rights research. I'm a sociologist, so I'm so much into the term debunking. So debunking the taken for granted ways of doing human rights research and going beyond like the national level characteristics of transitional justice, going beyond the simple frequency of human rights violation, going beyond our conventional understanding of censorship, going beyond our conventional understanding of norm development. So that really, that is about what Beth Simmons talked about, going beyond the headlines. I think we were talking about the same thing. The other thing is that in the process of debunking, I think it was very clear to us that we can be really greatly benefited from new advances in computational methods and survey experiments, data storage, and big data, even though there are some pitfalls and downside to it. And then I was struck by what you said about the possibility that big data can really talk about small things, small stories, but small data can talk about big stories. That is entirely possible. But I think even though, nevertheless, we demonstrated, the advances in new methodologies can really inform us when it comes to a better way of doing human rights research. In the process of debunking, we also realized that we need to continue on refining and modifying, more well-received approaches and methodologies like interviews and comparative historical analysis and case studies and simple regression analysis. So I think in that way, we can achieve incredible balance of doing scientific research on human rights. I'm also very pleased to report that we're also able to highlight some of the new issues, like right to marriage and right to family and right to reproduction, and bringing these new topics one step closer to the terrain of human rights research. And also, all the participants were able to expand, I think, taken together, expand the boundaries of human rights research by not only covering more new issues, but also getting deeper into difficult issues confronting the human rights research community. So one more thing I want to add to that is that, I think we need to figure out ways to work together, like interdisciplinary research. Many of us doing political science and sociology, and I know that Kyo right now is serving as the chair of the human rights section at American Sociological Association. And then we have chair-elect Brian Grant taking over the job next year. And I know that there are many political scientists who are involved with human rights section in ISA, International Studies Association. So I think in the future we could figure out ways to work together. I think that could be a really promising field we can consider. So now, finally, I think I've got the solemn duty to mention about people really contributed to this event, people who made it possible that we really celebrated, accomplished a lot throughout the day. Kyotero Chuchui. We actually began working together from the fall last year, And then it's been a couple months working together. I'd love to count the number of emails we communicated with each other. It could be like approximately like 200 emails, a lot of emails. And then I'm so nocturnal, so I tend to write emails at night, at 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. That's the time when you wake up and then respond to my emails. And you've been really faithful, and then you're so meticulous and just fantastic. And then one day, actually, do you remember? You would remember that there was a Pyeongchang Winter Olympic Games, and then I saw like 2 Japanese and Korean speed skaters who were Japanese Kodairo, Japanese woman won the gold medal from the 500-meter speed skating. And the South Korean player, Lee Sang-hwa, won the silver medal. And then they showed the world the friendship, like hugging each other, comforting each other. And then whenever I saw that, as soon as I saw that, I thought about you, actually. And then I went to my working station and writing an email right away to you and mentioning about what I saw. And then the way you responded was that, Jung-woo, we could be, people like those 2 athletes at some point. We can work together and show the world that, we can contribute to the peace. Okay, so. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. So I think I really appreciated the long process, like preparing for this conference. And then in terms of like choosing the people who would make presentations, we actually created the list of scholars who are really promising and doing a lot of innovative things. And Charles really helped us in creating the list. And then I think I cannot think of any other combination that would work better than the combination we had for today. So thank you. Special thanks goes to Kyoteru Chuchui. And then I should also mention about the staffers from the Donia Center, Human Rights Center, and Brina Warner. Right, she's done a fantastic job, and I know that you had a lot of events taking place at the same time, and then you had to like deal with all those things at the same time. So because of that, your schedule was crazy, hectic. Because I know about all those, I really appreciate that. And Natasha Gruden, she's not here, I guess. So I think I really appreciate her support as well. And then from the Korean side, and as I said, one of the organizers was SSK Human Rights Forum. We are a group of scholars who get funding from the South Korean Ministry of Education. And then we've been studying and researching about human rights for the last 8 years or so with the same funding. And then Kyoteru Chuchui is one of the members, and David Schwartz is one of the members, and Amanda Murdy is the member, and Charles is an associate member of SSK Human Rights Forum. And the event might not have been possible without the support from staffers from the SSK Human Rights Forum, in particular, Hyunmin, Hyunmin Lee. She has been swamped with processing all the payments, which is the most important, I guess. One thing we were trying to accomplish was to process the payments like as quickly as possible, so that by the time everybody comes to this conference, and they know that the money are on their bank accounts. So many of you might have received the money already, but for others, you will be bank wired any day. And then Dae Kim, Kim Dae, also SSK Human Rights staff, and I think I'm really grateful for your support. The other organizer and sponsor, the Nam Center for Korean studies here, and we're really grateful for that. And then there's one more member, actually, well, actually two members. One is Professor Chang-Lok Seo, who is the principal investigator of the SSK Human Rights Forum. He's the man, the leader, commander-in-chief. So thanks for your continuing support, and we have a couple more years to go, and we're looking forward to your continuing support and enthusiasm. And then finally, one member I really want to extend my gratitude is Donia, Mr. Donia, over there, right? Mr. Donia, yeah. So we really appreciate your support. And then, again, this event might not have been possible without the support from you and other donors. I really appreciate that. Okay, I think my solemn duty has been fulfilled. If I missed out somebody else, just blame me. Nobody's fault. And thank you so much. And then I can't really tell, how impressed I was, how I feel about the accomplishments, we've made. And congratulations to every one of you. Thank you. Thank you so much.